Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for tonight's NWHM Presents. My name is Emma, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum, and I will be your host today. A few housekeeping notes. Our panelists will be answering questions at the end of the conversation. You are welcome to ask your questions at any time during the program by using the Q&A feature located on your toolbar in Zoom. You may ask your question at any time during the presentation, but we will be answering them at the end of the program, and our panelists are incredibly happy to answer your questions. And with that, I would like to introduce our guests. Sherry Boschert is an award-winning journalist and the author of 37 Words, Title IX, and the 50 Years of Fighting Sex Discrimination, published by the New Press. Hello, Sherry. And Plug-in Hybrids, the Cars That Will Recharge America. Among her many honors, she received a Distinguished Service Award from the Society of Professional Journalists for her efforts to promote equity within the news industry. After 40 years in the San Francisco Bay Area, she now lives in New Hampshire. Our second guest is Eileen H. Tamura, and she is Professor Emerita at the University of Hawaii at Manoa College of Education, where she chaired the Department of Educational Foundations. Hi, Eileen. She served as president of the History of Education Society, associate editor of the History of Education Quarterly, and editorial board members of the Journal of American Ethnic History. In addition to journal articles and chapter essays, she's authored, co-authored, and edited 8 history books, including the Oxford Handbook of the History of Education, which she co-edited. We are really excited for this conversation. And with that, Sherry and Eileen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emma.
Thank you.
Eileen and I talked a bit beforehand, and we've read each other's books, and hopefully some of you out there have read our books, maybe. But we have questions for each other, so we're just going to have a little dialogue and conversation about the subject matter that is common to both of our books. So I'm going to start off because, Eileen, I wondered if you could tell us briefly, what does Title IX cover? Sort of an introduction for anyone who may not be as immersed in it as we are.
Okay. First, let me read the 37 words, the first 37 words of the law. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So you can see that Title IX applies to all educational institutions receiving federal funds. So that would be preschools, elementary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, technical schools, vocational schools, adult education schools, and any other school that deals with teaching. So schools cannot discriminate by sex. So not in scholarships, for example, healthcare, athletics, or whatever else is in that school, as long as the school receives federal monies. And this covers both students and employees. Now, I'd like to point out that at the beginning of the effort, it was focused rather narrowly. It was focused on higher education, and because of that, the advocates were looking at white, middle class or upper middle class women because they were attending colleges and universities. They were professional or aspiring professional women. Then gradually, advocates realized that K-12 schools also received federal funding. So it became more inclusive and included all classes. And gradually, the awareness became that it involved all ethnic and racial groups, and more recently, the LGBTQ plus community. So as long as it centers on education, which it does, it touches the lives of most people.
And, you know, one of the things that caught my eye in reading your book that I really appreciated was you used the word caste and casteism in describing especially how things were in the 1960s and 70s for women. And I think it still goes on some today, but can you talk a little bit about why you chose those words and what they mean in this context?
Okay, well, I had read Isabel Wilkerson's excellent book called Caste, and it made me think, and she focused on the African-American experience, and it made me think of applying it to women, to gender issues. So caste deals with hierarchy, ranking, control, power, privilege, and status. And there are instances that I will discuss in a few minutes that show how caste worked as applied to women. And it's essentially an artificial construct, but it's in the minds of, it's taken for granted. So it's understood as the natural order of things. So the first example I want to look at is Edith Green's experience in Congress. Now, Edith Green was the author of Title IX, and we'll talk about her later, but I just like to say that she came to the House in the 1950s. So in the 1960s and 70s, she was already a senior member of Congress. And so she was the chair of the subcommittee on education because of seniority. And despite that, she and two other women who were subcommittee chairs were shut out of leadership meetings. So the doors to policy meetings were literally closed to her. As the congressmen told her, leadership is a man's job. That's what they told her. And so they could not talk about policy in these meetings. Now, the women, this was the thinking of the time, and the women, and this was in the 1960s, well, earlier, but in the 1960s and 70s. And women in 1970, for example, had very little power to change this because in 1970, they made up only there were 9 of the 435 House members. And there were, at that time in 1970, there were no US senators that year. Now, Green was no shrinking violet.
Hardly.
She differed from some of the other women in Congress. She was very assertive. She studied she knew the issues. And one thing about her that stood out was she was a polished debater, and she commanded attention on the House floor. So whenever she spoke, people, even the men, listened. Now, because of her personality and the way she behaved, the men resented her. And they called her things behind her back. For example, overaggressive and castrating. And they gave her horrible nicknames. They called her Smiling Cobra and a Wicked Witch of the West. So you can see this was the social climate of the time. So the second example I want to mention is Bernie Sanders' experience. So I'm going to ask Sherry now to show you a clip of one of her interviews.
And I should say that throughout our discussion, I'll be showing 3 or 4 one-minute videos of some of the people I interviewed for my book, some of whom Eileen also interviewed for her book. And this first one is the woman known as the godmother of Title IX, Bernie Sandler. Let me see if I can share screen here. play?
I wanted to be a professor. I wanted to teach. I love to teach. I got into women's issues because I was teaching, a course or two all the time. I was getting my doctorate at Maryland in the School of Education, and I loved teaching. And finally got my doctorate and was still teaching, and they had 7 openings and didn't even think of me at all. It wasn't even considered. And I really am a good dynamic teacher and so forth. So I went to one of the guys and I said, they didn't even think of me. I need to know why. And then he said, without skipping a beat, let's face it, Bunny, you come on too strong for a woman. And I went home and I cried. Yes, I never should have opened my mouth in graduate school. I used to, was an active participant in the class and so forth. And my then husband was really quite good on this issue, and he said, are there strong men in the department? And I remember weeping and saying, yes, in tears. When he said, then it's not you, it's sex discrimination. And that had not occurred to me. And it took me a few weeks to put it together that something bad had happened and it was called sex discrimination.
Okay, so soon after Sandler's experience at the University of Maryland, she looked for other jobs, academic jobs, and she had rejections, despite being well qualified. And in the second and third interviews, she did have interviews, but in the second and third interviews, she was told that she shouldn't be looking for an academic position. She shouldn't be looking to be a professional because she should be at home taking care of the home. Now, her children were in high school. They were old enough and they weren't at home during the day, but nevertheless, that's what she was told. At this time, her experience was typical of what was going on at the universities and colleges. In 1960, for example, women made up only 8% of full professors, while they constituted a much larger percentage of all those who received their doctorate. So now I'll go to the third example of caste. And this was the reaction of the NCAA and the men's athletic coaches soon after Title IX became law. When Title IX was moving through Congress, there were some talk about athletics, but not much. And after Title IX became law, the NCAA realized, wait a second, this is going to be big. And they didn't want to lose the prestige and power and monies they were receiving in sports. And so for years after Title IX was passed, they continued to lobby Congress, and senators and representatives continued to try to exempt intercollegiate competitive sports from Title IX. But fortunately, they were unsuccessful. Okay.
Yeah, it was just so ingrained in everyone's minds, in terms of caste. I mean, Bernice Sandler would tell a story that, when she was young and a child, she wanted to do some of the things in her elementary school that only the boys got to do. The boys got to be the crossing guards and wear the sashes,
Yes.
and the boys got to go to the basement to refill the inkwells. And she wanted to do it, but she was told, no, you can't because you're a girl. And she just accepted it. That's caste, right? That's just this interior perception that, some people can do some things and some people are not allowed to do those things. But Eileen, much of your book examines the happenings in the year before Congress acted to create Title IX. You discuss, characters like Esther Peterson and Catherine East, and Sandler filing her complaints based on the executive orders. Tell us about that cast of characters and what was going on at the time.
Okay, much of my book discusses the 1960s, the decade before Congress began to really look at Title IX. And I do this because I recognize there were activities going on then that laid the foundation for Title IX. And this is what I call the other half of the story. So, and I'm looking outside of Congress. There were two people in the federal government, but they were not in Congress. One was Esther Peterson. She was Assistant Secretary of Labor under the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. She was head of the Women's Bureau. And she, of course, was very interested in women's rights, women's employment. And she did quite a few things, but the thing that I want to mention is that she was instrumental in convincing Johnson and his top aides to have Johnson issue Executive Order 11375. This was the executive order that for the first time, banned sex discrimination by entities receiving federal contracts. This was significant. It wasn't talked about much then, but it became significant when people realized that schools received a lot of federal contracts. And so this became like one of the foundation elements for Title IX. And Esther Peterson did it, not by herself, but with her network of supporters and advocates in government and also outside of government. And Peterson worked quietly and persistently to get President Johnson, to sign this executive order. And we're going to talk about this later because it becomes very important. So another person I want to mention who worked in government, but in the federal government, not in Congress, was Catherine East. Now, the public didn't know anything about Catherine East because she was a civil service employee. She worked for 40 years in the federal government. And during the decades, she moved up the ladder and eventually had a senior staff position in the Women's Bureau. During this time she was in the federal government, she was also active in women's groups. So she had a wide network of women connections outside of the federal government. And after 40 years, she had a network of supporters inside the government. And the thing that she did that was really important, she distributed information. You see, the Women's Bureau collected a lot of data on women, employment, their status, and so forth. And one of the roles of the Women's Bureau was to distribute this information. And Catherine East was pivotal in doing this. She worked with other staffers and they would photocopy, they called it Xeroxing, right? All these papers, and she would mail them out to interested people. And people would call her, write to her, and so forth. She sent them to attorneys, to women's groups, to legislators, to Congress members and their staffers, anyone who asked her for information. So and she didn't want to speak out in public, so she never gave big speeches in public. So in her quiet, behind the scenes manner, she became a central figure because she was able to give information and educate a lot of people about the status of women. And the third person I want to mention is Bernice Sandler. And we spoke about her, you heard her on video. She was an aspiring professor and she was rejected for academic jobs because she was a woman. And so because of these rejections, she thought that she'd better read up on civil rights history and civil rights issues, civil rights laws. So as she did this, she saw a footnote in one of her articles that she was reading, and it talked about Executive Order 11375. Now, this was the executive order that Esther Peterson had really convinced Johnson to sign. And when Bernice Sandler read about this EO, she shrieked because she realized that colleges and universities got a lot of federal contracts, and therefore they were subject to this prohibition from discriminating by sex. And she needed to spread the word. So she went to academic conferences, she talked to women there, and she spoke to groups there, and the women there said, okay, they're going to send her data from their universities and colleges. And that's what they did. So that's how she amassed a lot of information on what was going on in the colleges and universities. Admissions of women and employment, positions of faculty positions, full professor positions, and so forth. And she collected all of this. And now the women were afraid of having their names put on the complaint letters. And she assured them that she would use no names. The women didn't want retaliation because in those days you could be fired if you had a complaint. So she did not use names, but she would send out letters of complaint to the Department of Labor. And in 2 years, she was able to send out letters complaining about 250 colleges and universities across the country. And she attached full documentation to these letters of complaint. And importantly, she sent copies of these complaints to Congress members, and that educated them. And one of the people who received her letter and documentation was Representative Edith Green. And that's how the two of them eventually met. And we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but it sort of comes down to the light bulb went off in Sandler's head. Oh, she read this footnote in an obscure government document because her mother had taught her what she called bibliotherapy. If you don't understand something, ask. And if you still don't understand it, read everything you can find about it. And so that's what she was doing when she was trying to figure out, why won't anyone even interview me for a job? And that led her to the executive orders. And of course, none of this was happening in a vacuum, right? There was the whole women's movement surging in the 1960s. And the same time that Esther Peterson was working inside to get the executive order passed, that would be the tool that led to Title IX, the National Organization for Women, their leaders were pushing hard from the outside. There's a lot of that in their archives in the Schlesinger Library. But you're right, it caught the eye of Edith Green, thank goodness. And her nickname in Congress was Mrs. Education. She was a former teacher, and any legislation that went through Congress had her imprint on it. She was Mrs. Education. So let's talk about Congress then. And okay, how did Congress then act? I mean, Sandler had her moment of truth in 1969, trying to figure this out. And by January of 1970, she was filing federal complaints to the Department of Labor under the executive orders. And then it catches Edith Green's eyes. How would you characterize the whole movement through Congress?
Yes. Now I'm keeping track of time, so we're about 12:30. So not 12:30. This is 12:30 in Hawaii. It's 6:30, right?
Yeah.
On the East Coast. Okay. So really quickly, in a nutshell, I'd like to say that Edith Green, having had all this data from Sandler, realized that now she had wanted previously to have a bill on discrimination against women in education, but she didn't have enough data. But with Sandler's mailing to her, she saw that she had a lot of data, and with that, she decided to meet Sandler, and she introduced the bill, and she held hearings on on discrimination by sex in education. And this was the first hearing on this. And so after before the hearing, she had authored the bill. So she authored Title IX, what became Title IX. She was the lead sponsor, and she worked closely with Senator Birch Bayh, who was the lead sponsor and author in the Senate. And now Greene's first version of Title IX amended the Civil Rights Act of 1964 by adding sex to the list of prohibited categories. Now, there were people who supported this and opposed this. The Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Jerris Leonard, who testified at Greene's hearing, recommended that she not amend the Civil Rights Act, instead write a standalone provision. Now, Greene eventually, not at the beginning, but eventually did follow his advice, because essentially she was a strong advocate of civil rights for Blacks. And she realized that if she had tried to amend the Civil Rights Act of 1964, she would be opening up the act to weakening amendments. And she didn't want to do that, because without getting into the weeds, 8 years earlier, she had voted against adding sex to Title VI of the Civil Rights Bill. And she said she didn't want the issue of sex to gut the Civil Rights Bill, which was for minorities, Blacks and other minorities. And she believed, she said this publicly, that the rights for Blacks came before civil rights for women. And that was her belief. So her final version eventually made Title IX a standalone provision. Now, let me quickly just go to her subcommittee. She was the only woman, she was the chair and the only woman on the subcommittee. The others were men, Republicans and Democrats. And the men, there were enough men who could take out the Title IX provision from this large. Title IX was one provision of a large education bill. And because of their opposition, she agreed to take out that provision, because she realized that in the parent committee, the Education and Labor Committee, she would have enough support to put that Title IX provision back in. And that's what happened. So the bill moved out of the Education and Labor Committee onto the House floor with a version of Title IX there. Now, on the House floor, however, Representative John Erlenborn was able to weaken this Title IX provision substantially by convincing House members to allow sex discrimination in admissions to both public and private colleges and universities. And that essentially guts the bill, because it takes out an essential element, because what was happening was women had a cap. If there were too many women applying to a college or universities, the university could say, oh no, we're going to cap it at 20%, 25%, 15%, whatever the university wanted.
And that was very common back then. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So anyway, that was a major defeat. However, she felt that maybe things would be righted in the conference committee. And in the Senate, just going to the Senate, Senator Birch Bayh tried many times to get this provision in the bill. He was not on the subcommittee on education, so that was a problem for him. So what he had to do, and the chair didn't want this provision in the bill because he had his own issues and he didn't want the issue of sex discrimination to mar his bill. So when the bill on education moved to the Senate floor, Bai offered his amendment banning sex discrimination in education for schools that receive federal funding. But he had defeat after defeat, and only after time passed, he was able to talk with his colleagues and convince enough of them, and he had to make compromises, but he was able to convince enough of them so that it moved out of the Senate with a provision that would be Title IX in it. And then, so now we reach the conference committee, where the House version and the Senate version are there, and the conferees are debating this huge education bill. And interestingly, at this point, they basically ignored Title IX because they were so wrapped up in their hot debate on two issues. There were more than two issues that they debated hotly, but school busing. As you know, in the 60s and 70s, school busing was very controversial. And so that was one of their debates, and the other was funding for higher education. So in all of this heated debate, Title IX slipped under the radar and was accepted with just some discussion, but not anything substantial. And that's when it went and passed conference committee and then was voted out of the Senate and House.
And to give you all a sense, I mean, there were 246 differences between the House and Senate versions of the bigger education bill, of which Title IX was a small part. There were 10 differences just about Title IX between the Senate and the House version. And Green did have to use 6 proxy votes and, you know, her fortitude to get it through. In the end, because she didn't like some of the busing provisions and the financial aid provisions, she ended up voting against the bill. So, you know, we don't have the time to go into details about the whole journey through Congress. This is just a synopsis. But I want to go back for one point that you raised about the idea initially of amending Title VI of the Civil Rights Act to add the word sex, because Title VI prohibited discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, not just in education, but in broad swaths of society, housing, transportation, public accommodations, all kinds of stuff. And the idea was just insert the word sex. And when Green held her hearings about sex discrimination in education, all of President Nixon's representatives said, no, don't do that. Just make it a standalone law. But all the women's advocates were saying, just amend Title VI. The women of color were divided on this. Some of the people who testified at the hearings, Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968, she testified that sexism had always been a bigger obstacle to her than racism, and that, you know, we should be adding this with the other categories in Title VI. On the other hand, Frankie Freeman, who was at the time the only woman and the only Black person on the U.S. Commission for Civil Rights, she said, no, make it its own law, because she was concerned, like Eileen said, that if you start amending Title VI, you're going to dilute attention from dealing with this massive problem of racism. I mean, keep in mind, this was only 6 years after the Civil Rights Act passed. We were not, as a nation, doing a great job in fighting back against racism. And she was afraid it would dilute that. Well, those two Black women, Chisholm and Frankie Freeman, had very different backgrounds. Chisholm was a Barbadian American who lived in Brooklyn, and Frankie Freeman grew up in the Deep South. And so, you know, there is no one single view of what to do. And for a year, the idea of amending Title VI bounced in and out of the legislation that Green was considering Harry Hogan, who was her legislative counsel on the subcommittee, was the one writing it. And every time he would negotiate with Sandler or the legal genius Polly Murray, at the hearings, she was the one who said, yes, you should add sex to Title VI, because you really can't separate all these discriminations. I mean, it was intersectional discrimination before we started using that term. She said, these are all tied together, so you might as well have them all in the same law. But it bounced in and out of legislation, and in the end, they made Title IX a separate law, and that has ramifications for how the law played out in the future that, we'll talk about later if we get a chance to. But that too is a fascinating part of the story to me. We've mentioned a lot of names here, and Edith Green being the mother of Title IX, and then Birch Bayh adopting her legislation was the father of Title IX. But just to set the record straight, Eileen, you and I both were surprised by this when we started doing our research. There's a widespread misconception that Representative Patsy Takemoto Mink, who was the first woman of color elected to Congress from the state of Hawaii, and the first Asian American elected to Congress, woman, she is credited all over the internet and a lot of people's minds as the author of Title IX. What role did she really play in Title IX history?
Yes, in fact, when I started my research on Title IX, I was planning to write about Patsy Mink and Title IX. And so I went to her papers, and that's when I found out that no, she didn't author Title IX. There weren't too many papers on exactly Title IX documentation, but there was evidence of Edith Green. And that's when I went to Edith Green's papers and Birch Bayh's papers and realized, to my surprise, that I had started looking at the wrong person.
Same.
So anyway, so it was Edith Green, as we said, and Birch Bayh, who were the primary sponsors and authors in their respective houses of Congress. But Patsy Mink was a strong supporter of the bill, and she was a committed feminist, but she didn't author it, nor sponsor or co-sponsor it. She was not a member of the Education Subcommittee and the Subcommittee on Education, and the co-sponsors of the bill. Now, you have to remember, this is a huge bill. They're not talking about Title IX only. This is a huge education bill, and the co-sponsors were all the Democratic members of the subcommittee. We need to keep in mind that this is a huge education bill of about 282 pages. Title IX made up 4 pages of this large bill. Title IX was one title out of 20 titles or sections in the bill. So the men signing off as co-sponsors were looking at the large bill. And then that went to the full committee, the Education and Labor Committee. And that's when, and it stayed with the same co-sponsors and Edith Green as the author, and then went to the House floor. So the question is, what was Mink's role in the creation of Title IX? Now, I mentioned Jairus Leonard, that's Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Nixon administration, who went to the hearing and talked about having it, Title IX, as a standalone provision. I consider Jairus Leonard and all those who talked to Green, who agreed with him, as influencers on Green's thinking about her bill, because she was the author. Now, in the same vein, Mink was an influencer because she had discussed with Green the lack of strong provisions in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, lack of provisions against sex discrimination, strong provisions. And so, and they discussed what should be done about it and so forth. So in that sense, she was an influencer. But as for the co-author of Title IX, if a person wants to have a co-author, one could say that the co-author was Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because if you put the two titles side by side, you will see that the words are the same. The only difference is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says race, color, or national origin. Discrimination against these categories are prohibited. In Title IX, it uses the word sex and not those three words or three categories. And Title IX has the word education added. So that's the difference. So if you want a co-author, then it would be Title VI. So when did Patsy Mink take a bigger role? Now, after Title IX became law, there was a big backlash. The sports, athletics interests were really trying to kind of exempt their area from Title IX. At that time, Edith Green resigned 2 years after Title IX was passed. And she retired, rather, from Congress. And Birch Bayh lost the 1980 election to Dan Quayle in 1980 in the Reagan Revolution. So with Green and Bayh left, there were other people like Shirley Chisholm, but Mink became the most visible defender of Title IX, and she became the face of Title IX for years and years and years after Title IX. There were constant efforts to lessen the impact of Title IX. So she was the face during that time. And so she became the face of Title IX, and the media picked up on it, and authors picked up on it and believed that she was the author and sponsor. And she did a very important thing. What she was able in 1974 to have her bill passed called the Women's Educational Equity Act. And this was an important law that was a companion to Title IX. It looked at the curricula and programs and were aimed at bringing gender equity at lower levels of schooling, K to 12, as well as colleges and universities.
Yeah, I'd like to describe that as, I'd like to describe that as the carrot as opposed to the stick. I mean, Title IX is the stick. You must comply with this law. The Women's Educational Equity Act that Mink authored was the carrot. We can give you federal funding to figure out better ways to get rid of sex discrimination in education. It was a good combo package.
Okay, so I'm gonna stop here with because we need to go to Sherry's book, and we don't have that much time. So
yeah, in the interest of time, let's just do a couple of questions and then see if our listeners have questions. And if not, we can go on talking forever, really.
Okay, so I want to ask you about two things, if we can do it within this time frame. One is sexual harassment, because that's an issue that is going on in the colleges and universities today. So would you talk about that? And if you have time, talk about this gripping story that you talk about in your book on Pamela Price.
Yeah, you know, for our listeners, Eileen's book and my book overlap a little bit. She deals much more than I do with the decade before Title IX became reality. And then there's, you know, about 5 or 10 years where our books overlap. And then my book goes on to the present. And so today, you know, a lot of people of my generation, I'm kind of old, if they know Title IX at all, know it as related to sports, to athletics. It's the law that got girls into sports. But if you talk to students today, if they know Title IX at all, often they only know it as related to sexual assault and sexual harassment. And this is not a new issue. I'm going to show a 1-minute video clip of Pamela Price, who was one of the plaintiffs in the very first lawsuit under Title IX against sexual harassment and assault, called Alexander v. Yale. So let me see if I can share screen again so you can hear her story. I mean, basically she was a sophomore at Yale University, and she got sick at the end of the term and got some extensions on handing in some papers. And she went to hand in one of her political science papers, and I'll let her tell her story. Let's see here. We will go here. And
he's dropping these clues and I'm totally oblivious. I'm just like, yeah, I don't want to see. That's great. I hope it's not a C either. But then he starts to repeat it. Well, I really, really would hate to give you a C. Okay, I don't want a C. I really, really, really would hate to give you a C. And I'm saying, I don't want to see, and finally he just says, well, will you make love to me? And again, I had no frame of reference. All I could think was no. No, I'm not. And so I remember just sitting there saying no. And, trying to process it in my own mind and just continue. All I could say was no, no, but not with any force, just really no. Probably by the time I got down to the bottom of the stairs, I'm thinking, I'm going to get a seat. I didn't sleep with him. I got angry. I got confused. I didn't know what to think.
so that's Pamela Price in her own words. And meanwhile, other women activists at Yale were dealing with similar issues. And together they launched Alexander v. Yale, the first lawsuit. And the beauty of Alexander v. Yale, this was in 1977, was the very first judge who took a pass at it, which would have been in December of 77, I believe. He ruled for the very first time that yes, you should be safe from sexual harassment under Title IX. How can anyone expect you to have equal access to education if you have to put up with this? And that was the ruling that made Title IX an important tool for dealing with sexual harassment and assault. Unfortunately, he also threw out all of the other plaintiffs except Pamela Price on technicalities, which left this as a lawsuit of one young Black woman student against an established white male professor. And the next judges that came along, instead of accepting that what the lawsuit was trying to do was get Yale to adopt a grievance policy, because none of the schools had them back then, the judges turned it into a tort case. Can you prove that this happened, and can you prove any harm? And basically they lost. The women lost. Pamela Price lost. The case was a failure, except that it got that initial ruling saying, yes, Title IX applies to sexual harassment and assault. And we've gone on since then as an important tool as part of the movement against sexual violence. These are all part of movements, right? The civil rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, the movements against sexual violence. And something that may look like a loss ends up being a win if it gets used again in the future. So I don't have time to go into a whole lot of that history. I encourage you to read the book. There's a lot in there.
I want to, since we don't have much time, but since you didn't have enough time to talk about your book, what key idea or ideas would you like people to think about from your research?
Yeah, well, I talked about this being a movement. They're part of larger social movements. And that's an important part of this whole story. I mean, the movements are characters in my book. And I want to circle back to that idea of amending Title VI, because if we want Title IX to be a success, if we want to really deal with sex discrimination in education, we have to deal with the intersectional discrimination. I don't have time to show the videos of my interviewees talking about this, but if we don't deal with the fact that, in athletics, Title IX has helped millions of women but the vast majority of those benefits have gone to white women and white women athletes and not women of color athletes. If we don't deal with that, Title IX will never be a success. So I want you to see this as part of a broader movement. Everyone listening right now is part of these movements. You know, whether you do anything or not, it's, you know, you have a role to play, and the young people have a role to play. There's no end to this story. That's how I end my book, really. You know, it's, the movements are ongoing, and we've learned a lot about ourselves and about our society that can point the way to making Title IX fully a success.
Yes.
And Eileen, what do you want people to know from your book?
Yeah, well, just one comment on what you said. 50 years later, we're in towards the end of the 50th anniversary. We've come a long way, but there are still a lot of challenges, as you know, from what's happening in the news, and we hear about it in terms of women in sports. They are still getting short shrift, and women in terms of sexual harassment, and the LGBTQ community, with Secretary of Education Cardona issuing an addition to the regulation, and then you know, it's out there for public input, but it's a very controversial issue. Transgender women playing sports, that has been very controversial.
So I just want to add 2 sentences on that, and then maybe we'll have a couple minutes for questions. Read the book, read the history, because in the 1970s, when they were writing the regulations, everyone was wrestling with, how do we let any women participate in sports? What does that look like? What's fair? What's equitable? And it was not a given that sports would be divided into men's and women's sports. That was just one option that they were considering. And it's an option that probably doesn't apply as well today, as we now have a better understanding that there are intersex people, there are transgender people, there are non-binary people. How do those people get access in a binary system? And so there's various alternatives that were debated, and I don't have time, but read the book to find out why we ended up with what we did, and that'll help inform thinking about where do we go from here. So do we have any questions with the limited time we have left?
Yeah, Emma.
We do, and I want to thank you and echo a comment that was put in the chat that I wish this had been a 2-hour presentation so you two could share more of your knowledge and research on these issues in Title IX. This has been a fascinating and very informative overview. So we do have a question from the audience, which is that they would love for you to explain the role of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, in early legislation on Title IX.
Yeah.
Eileen, you want to go first?
I'll just begin it, and please add to it. Well, the ERA was appearing in Congress about the same time as Title IX was appearing in Congress. And the ERA seemed to have passed well, it did pass Congress, but then when it went to the states, it became more and more controversial. And in a sense, the ERA, in its controversy, took the heat away from Title IX, because people were afraid of what this ERA was going to do, and there was a lot of rhetoric and a lot of protests both ways. And Title IX seems so innocuous. I mean, schools, that's all. It's not going to do the whole thing, you know, in every facet of our society. It was just going to take care of schools. Oh, well, that's okay. They didn't realize, though, the implications of having schools as the center, education as the center, because everyone is touched by education. So men and women, I mean, young boys and girls all go through school, and there are a lot of employees of every facet of education, and they're all impacted. So what was thought of as just a small bit turns out to be much bigger. Meanwhile, the ERA scares people because it encompassed during the time the ERA was being debated, in the House, there were bills that were companions to the ERA. They were very all-encompassing. Patsy Mink was involved with that, and a lot of other House members were involved. But they were so controversial that they were killed, and they never saw the light of day after that. So the role that I see ERA playing is really important because it put the spotlight on that instead of Title IX.
Yeah, people, except for a handful of insiders, nobody noticed Title IX passed. I mean, it got, I think, one sentence in the New York Times, and that was disparaging. You have to realize in the early 1970s, from about 1970 to 1973, there was this magic window of time when the men in Congress hadn't quite figured out the ramifications of these bills for women's rights. And they were like, okay, let's give the women something. We'll agree to this bill, and a whole bunch of bills were passed about so many topics. Many more were introduced. I mean, Representative Bella Abzug of New York, every bill that crossed her desk, she would put something for women in it. So we had a couple of years where a lot was passing, but the ERA caught a lot of attention, drew a lot of pushback. And as people started to see what all these other laws, what the ramifications of them would be, like Title IX and, athletics, then there started to be more pushback. So it's good that we got the laws that we could in those few years, because something like Title IX would never pass today.
I mean, that's amazing to think that Title IX could be considered innocuous or small, given given what you two started to touch on with its absolutely enormous impact. And I think that's where I would kind of like to end our conversation today, is by asking each of you what you think has been Title IX's greatest impact. And I'm also going to ask our audience what they think Title IX's greatest impact is. But Eileen, would you like to start?
Well, what is the impact of Title IX? It's all encompassing. I mean, it touches every facet of our lives, even if we're not aware of it. Even if you say, well, I wasn't involved, it didn't touch me, it did. In occupations, I mean, you don't see, now we take it for granted. Flight attendants, male flight attendants, male nurses. I mean, there's so many male nurses, and women physicians. I mean, there are more women students, medical students than men, and lawyers and so forth. And we used to, I'm older, so I would say, and your doctor, what does he do? And then I realize now many doctors are women. I mean, I have women doctors, and we shouldn't say he. I mean, it could be anyone. It could be a transgender. It could be a bi identity person, and so forth. So just saying education, any institution that teaches in some way, it doesn't have to be a school, but teaches in some way and receives federal funding, is impacted. So I would say that the impact of Title IX is so immense that we don't even know what it is.
And I want to just add first, if any of you want to hear us talk more, I'm sure Eileen and I would be happy to be in dialogue for another session anywhere, or invite either of us individually. You can reach me through my blog, which is also called 37 Words at sherryboschert.com. But I just want to throw out a few statistics to give you a sense of the magnificent progress that we've made with Title IX and the challenges that remain. So this started out as a jobs thing. You heard Bernice Sandler wanting a job in academia. Well, thanks to Title IX, women were a majority of college students by 1979. They became a majority of law students by 2016, and of new medical students by 2017. So culture change does take time, even if you have a good law on your side. Women filled nearly half of higher ed jobs by 2018, but still were bunched in lower ranks, and only a third of full professors were women. We still have a ways to go. There's much greater attention now, thank you to Title IX, about sexual harassment and sexual assault on campus. But the rates of sexual misconduct by 2019 hadn't dropped. So there's, people are trying to deal with this problem. We've got a long way to go. There's an estimated 5.5 million students in 2018 alone were affected by sexual misconduct. In athletics, in high school, more than 10 times as many girl athletes were playing in 2017 by 1972. But that's still fewer than the number of boys playing athletics in high school in 1972. So great gains, a ways to go. In college, women's share of NCAA athletic opportunities increased from 15% of playing slots in 1972 to 44% in 2018. But that really should be 57% based on their share of the student population. Millions more scholarships go to men athletes. And now with the name, image, and likeness issue, don't even get me started. So who gets left behind? Some women are getting left behind. In 2021, only 20% of faculty were people of color, if you count women and men. So there's not equity there yet. And I mentioned this earlier, of women's NCAA playing slots in 2018, white women got 69%, while nearly half of undergraduates are people of color. So we got to deal with that intersectional discrimination. We've got to deal with the same old sexism going on still. But we have to celebrate Title IX at the end of its 50th anniversary year and stay committed to the journey ahead.
Well, thank you for both of those takeaways. And as someone who went through grade school, college, and graduate school after the passage of Title IX, I just want to thank both of you for bringing to light the stories of all of the people who advocated and fought for Title IX, and to also, thank all of the advocates and the people who have come before me in my generation to make it possible for me to get a doctorate. So with that, again, I want to thank Sherry and Eileen for your time and your expertise and these wonderful, the wonderful overview and stories that you shared. And I want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. It's been so wonderful to listen to both of you and to now be in conversation. So with that, I want to wish everyone a good rest of their evening. Stay safe, continue learning, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you again, ladies.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.